She is standing across a gallery from me when it happens. The man beside her is charming, says all the right things, and I watch her laugh. That specific laugh. And her hand goes to his arm the way it does when something catches you off guard. I know that gesture. I have been cataloging it for 7 years, and in this exact moment I understand I have been patient for long enough. I cross the room. She sees me coming. Her expression shifts in the way it only shifts when she is reading me. She says 4 words I have never heard her say in public, not in 7 years. Certainly not about me. This is my person. The whole gallery goes still. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. The night I am talking about is a Saturday in October, but for it to make any sense at all, I have to go back further. I have to go back to a Tuesday in September 2 years earlier, which is when Simone Ardea called me at 11 in the evening from outside a bar in the rain and said her boyfriend had just ended things in the parking lot and she needed someone to come get her. I drove 40 minutes in the rain with my hazards on because the storm was bad enough to make the highway uncomfortable. And when I pulled up outside the bar, she was standing under the awning in a black dress that had gotten wet at the hem, her dark hair pushed back from her face, her expression the specific kind of blank that happens right after something breaks, rather than during the breaking. She got in the car without saying anything for a full minute. Then she said, "He said I wasn't what he needed anymore." I said, "He is wrong." She laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh she used when she was furious and did not trust herself to say what she actually thought. I had learned that laugh in year 2 and had been cataloging it ever since. I drove her to my apartment. I made her eat something. I sat beside her on the couch while she went through the phases the way people go through them. Anger first, then the quieter thing underneath it, then eventually the exhaustion that settles after you have finished being honest about how much something hurt. I stayed up until 3 in the morning with her, and when she finally fell asleep on the couch, I put a blanket over her shoulders and went to bed. That was the arrangement. I was the one she called. I had been the one she called since our second year of university, when we met in a visual arts elective that we both needed for credit requirements and neither of us particularly wanted to take. She was studying design. I was studying English literature. We sat at the same long table with our supplies spread between us, and the instructor explained the semester brief in terms that made both of us look at each other with the same measured skepticism at the same moment, and that was how it began. That was the exact moment. 7 years. 7 years of being the one she called. The one she texted at midnight. The one whose door was always unlocked, because that was what I had decided I wanted it to be. Even on the nights when wanting it cost more than I had calculated. I was not going to make it weird. That was the rule I had established for myself sometime in year 3, when I had spent long enough around Simone Ardea to understand that whatever I was feeling was not something she was equipped to hear. And that the most important thing, the thing I was not willing to risk, was her. All of her. The 3 in the morning phone calls and the Saturdays she appeared at my door with pastries from the bakery near her studio, and the way she talked about her work with the specific vocabulary of someone who loved what they did and assumed, without arrogance, that the person she was talking to would love it too. I had told exactly one person, Priya Osei, our mutual friend since 3rd year, who had looked at me for 10 seconds after I said it and then said, "I know. I have known since the gallery show in 2nd year. When she walked in, and you stopped talking mid-sentence." I said, "I did not stop talking mid-sentence." She said, "You were telling me about your thesis. You stopped, and you have never finished that sentence." That had been 5 years before the October in question. In those 5 years I had continued not finishing that sentence, and Priya had continued knowing, and Simone had continued being Simone, warm and expressive, and entirely unaware of the specific devastation she regularly made of my composure, simply by existing in the same room. She had been in 3 serious relationships in the time I had known her. The most recent before the rainy parking lot had lasted 11 months. His name was Marcus. and he was not a bad person, and every time Simone talked about him, I had listened with the careful attention of a woman who had made a policy of wanting the best for people she loved even when wanting it hurt. In 3 years of watching her navigate relationships that did not work, I had sat on kitchen floors at midnight, driven in rain, left work early, and said the useful things every time instead of the true ones. I had become very good at the useful things. By the October in question, 2 years after the rainy parking lot, Simone had been single for that entire stretch. 24 months without anyone else requiring my managed distance and practiced restraint. 24 months of the friendship existing at full, uninterrupted wait. The way it only existed when it was just the two of us. It was the worst and best 2 years of my adult life. The Saturday in October is Priya's birthday. She has turned 30 and has rented out the back room of a wine bar with exposed brick and low lighting, and the kind of playlist that starts mellow and gets progressively louder as the evening deepens. About 30 people, the usual intersection of Priya's world and ours, and the friends of friends who have drifted into our orbit over the years. I arrive early to help set up. Simone arrives 40 minutes later in a dark green dress and the gold earrings she wears when she is trying to feel good about something. And I know she is trying to feel good because she texted me that afternoon to say she had seen Marcus with someone new on the street outside the pharmacy, and it had caught her off guard. I said, "That sounds hard." She said, "I thought I was past it." I said, "You are past it. This is just a Tuesday thing. It does not mean what you think it means." She sent 3 laughing faces and said, "You always know." I put my phone down and got back to what I was doing. The party is good. Priya is 30 and happy about it in the clean, uncomplicated way that some people manage to be happy about birthdays. And the wine is good, and the music eventually reaches the volume where people start moving toward the small cleared space that has become a dance floor by consensus. I watch Simone across the room for approximately 3 minutes before I make myself look somewhere else, which is my standard operating procedure and has been for years. She dances with people she knows. She talks to people I don't. She has 2 glasses of wine before I have finished my first, which I notice and file away without comment. Because Simone drinks more when she is processing something, and the pharmacy sighting is still fresh, and it is not my place to manage her drinking at a birthday party. She has a 3rd glass. At some point after 11, she appears at my elbow with a 4th glass in hand and says, "We haven't danced." "We never dance," I say. "We dance sometimes," she says. I say, "Give me that." And I take the glass out of her hand and swap it for a water glass I retrieve from the bar. She makes a face but accepts it. She says, "You are very responsible." I say, "One of us has to be." She says, "I like that you're the one who has to be." There is something in how she says it. Something with a different register than the usual easy warmth of our friendship. I look at her face, and she is looking at me with an expression I do not have a catalog entry for. Not the Simone who calls from parking lots in the rain. Not the Simone who appears with pastries. Not any of the 7-year known versions. Something else. Something that lives under all of those and has been living there quietly for a long time. I say, "Drink your water." She drinks her water. By midnight, she has had the 4th glass anyway, which I know because Priya finds me near the entrance and says, quietly, "Your girl is on glass 5, and she is in her feelings tonight. You might want to get her home." I say, "She's not my girl." Priya gives me the look she has been giving me for 5 years, the one that says everything her actual mouth does not say. I go find Simone. She is in a group near the bar, laughing at something, present and warm in the way she always is at gatherings. She is good at parties. She does not look like someone on glass 5 except in the slight looseness at the edges, the way she is standing, the warmth dialed 1 degree higher than her usual, the way she laughs a half beat longer than the joke warranted. She turns when I come up beside her, immediately, as if she has a specific awareness of where I am in any given room. She says, "There you are." I say, "Here I am." "Ready to get out of here?" She says, "I've been ready for an hour." We say goodbye to Priya. Priya squeezes my arm and says, "Be good." Then she winks, which I do not acknowledge because that way lies a conversation I am not prepared to have tonight. The car takes 12 minutes. Simone sits beside me with her shoulder against mine, her head tipped back against the seat, her eyes slightly unfocused, looking at the ceiling. She smells like the wine and her perfume, the warm woody one she has been wearing since university, the one I would know in absolute dark. She says, "I keep thinking about the pharmacy." I say, "I know," she says, "not because I want him back. I really don't want him back." I say, "I know." She says, "I just hate the feeling." I say, "Which feeling?" She is quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the city slides past in amber and neon. She says, "Like I've been measuring wrong. Like I've been looking in the wrong direction for years." I say, "What direction should you be looking?" She turns her head toward mine. In the moving streetlight, her face is very close. She says, "I don't know. I just keep thinking it's closer than I thought." The car pulls up outside my building. I pay without discussing it. I walk her up. She leans slightly into me in the elevator, not leaning on me exactly, just close. Close enough that the warmth of her arm comes through my sleeve. In my apartment, I get her water and toast, the practical scaffolding of looking after someone at the end of a long evening. She sits at the kitchen island and eats the toast and drinks most of the water and tells me more about the pharmacy and the patient. Circular way that people process things when they have stopped editing themselves. I listen. I say the useful things. At 1:30, she says, "I'm too tired to go home." I say, "Take the bed." "I'll take the couch." She says, "The couch is terrible for your back and we both know it. Come on. It's a large bed, and we have shared it before. And nothing was strange about it." This is true. We have shared the bed before. After the first breakup, and again during the early months of the pandemic when her lease had run out, and she stayed here 3 weeks while her new place was ready. Nothing had been strange about it because I had made sure nothing was strange about it, which had cost me several nights of lying very still in my half of a very large bed, pretending I was asleep, while I was in fact cataloging the particular sound of her breathing and trying to feel nothing about it. I say, "Fine, go ahead." She takes the bathroom first. I sit on the couch and look at the ceiling for a while, listening to the small sounds of her moving around in my apartment like she has lived here her whole life, because she might as well have. When I finally go in and change and turn off the lamps and lie down on my side of the bed, the room is dark enough that I can only track her by the warmth and the scent of her on the other side of the mattress. I am almost asleep. Genuinely almost, the conscious version of myself retreating towards something less complicated when the mattress shifts. I open my eyes. In the faint light from the window, Simone has turned toward me. She is lying on her side facing mine, close enough that I can feel the warmth of her before any contact is made, and she is awake, and she is looking at me in the dark. I say, "Simone." She says, "I know." I say, "What do you know?" She says, "I've wanted this for years." The room was very quiet after that. I lay there and felt the words arrive in me the way significant things arrive, not like a strike, more like a tide coming in slowly and all at once. My drunk best friend climbed into my bed and said I've wanted this for years, and the room was small and dark and smelled like her perfume, and something in my chest was doing something I did not have a name for in 7 years of carrying it. I said, "Simone, you've had quite a bit to drink tonight." She said, "I know." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "I've wanted this sober too. For a long time. I just needed enough drinks to stop editing myself." I could not find the language. I had been the one with the language for 7 years, the one who said the useful things, the right things, the things that kept the friendship intact and safe. And now I was lying in my own bed in the dark with the person I had loved since a gallery show in second year, and I could not find a single sentence that accounted for everything at once. I said, "Go to sleep." She said, "That is not an answer." I said, "I know. Go to sleep anyway." A pause. The city made its late-night sounds outside the window. She was still facing me. She said, "Are you angry?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you—" I said, "I need you to sleep, Simone. We'll talk in the morning." She went quiet. Then she shifted. Not away. Just the small rearrangement of someone settling. Her forehead came to rest against my shoulder. Not on it. Against it. A breath of contact, present and tentative and more undoing than anything I had experienced in recent memory. I did not move. She said, very quietly, almost to herself, 7 years, Thea. I said, "I know." She said nothing after that. I lay still in the dark and listened to her breathing slow toward sleep, and I did not allow myself to think about what had just happened or what it meant or what came next. I was very good at not allowing myself to think about things when thinking would not help. She was asleep in 12 minutes. I know because I counted. I did not sleep at all. In the morning, I was already in the kitchen when she woke up. Coffee, scrambled eggs, 2 paracetamol beside her cup. When she appeared in the doorway, she looked like a woman assembling the previous night's inventory, with the careful expression of someone hoping some items have different values in daylight. She sat. She ate. She drank half the coffee. Then she said, "About last night." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I was pretty drunk." I looked at her. She was looking at the coffee cup. Her hair loose around her face, still in my old university sweatshirt. And she was about to do the thing people do the morning after they have said something true. She was going to walk it back. I said, "You were." She said, "I think I said something I shouldn't have." I said, "What did you say?" She looked up. Something in my tone caught her. I said, "I'm asking because I want to know whether you remember it or whether you're guessing." She said, "I remember it." I said, "Then it wasn't something you shouldn't have said. It was something you said. Those are different things." A silence. She said, "Thea." I said, "You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. But don't tell me it shouldn't have been said when you remember saying it and you remember what you meant when you said it." Her jaw did something complicated. I said, "Eat your eggs." She ate her eggs. She left an hour later with the careful warmth she always brought to goodbyes, a hug that lasted the right amount of time, her hand briefly at the small of my back, my name said at the door the way she always said it, like it was the last word she wanted to use before leaving. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long time. The following week was the worst week in recent years and also the most informative. We texted with the normal frequency. Nothing in the frequency itself indicated anything had shifted. But the texture was different. The things we did not say were louder than the things we did. When she sent a photograph from the studio, the follow-up that usually came after, the elaboration, the turn towards something more personal, did not come. I was not going to push. I had said what I had said on Sunday morning, which was more than I had said in 7 years, and the next move belonged to her. Priya called on Wednesday. She said, "What happened at my party?" I said, "Nothing happened." She said, "Simone has been strange all week." I said, "You would need to ask Simone about that." She said, "Thea." I said, "Priya." A pause. She said, "Did she say something?" I said, "She said something." Priya made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm functional." She said, "That is not an answer." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm here when you want to not be functional." I said, "I know. That's why you're my friend." What I knew as the second week passed was that Simone was afraid. I could map her fear the way I could map her laugh. She was handling it the way she handled most uncomfortable things, maintaining the surface and hoping it would be enough. The surface was not enough between us. It had never been. The conversation that broke it open happened on a Thursday evening in November. She had come to pick me up from the publishing house and waited 20 minutes while I finished an emergency pass on a manuscript. I came off the elevator to find her reading on her phone with the contained focus she brought to things when she was trying not to notice she was waiting. She looked up when she saw me. She smiled. Real, and also slightly careful. I said, "I'm sorry. The Hartley pages needed—" She said, "It's fine. You're here now." We walked out together. On the pavement, she fell into step beside me with the easy familiarity of 7 years, and I let 2 minutes of silence pass before I said, "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it." She said, "Okay," I said. "The last 2 weeks have been polite." She said, "Is that a problem?" I said, "It is a problem. We are not polite with each other. Polite is for people who do not know each other well enough to be anything else, and you have been making coffee in my kitchen at 2 in the morning since we were 21. The polite version is one I am not willing to accept." She was quiet for a full block. I said, "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I am asking you to stop pretending that Sunday morning did not happen. Because it happened. And you said what you said. And I heard it." She said, "I know you heard it." I said, "Then talk to me." We were in the park between the publishing house and the restaurant, the one we walked through on evenings when neither of us was in a hurry. The November air was cold enough to make the conversation feel bounded, contained, specific. She said, "I don't know what I'm doing." I said, "That is honest. Keep going." She said, "I have been trying to figure out what I was saying for 2 weeks, and every time I come back to the same place, and the same place is—" She stopped. I said, "Terrifying?" She looked at me. A small, surprised expression. I said, "You look the way you look when something is terrifying." She said, "Yes. Terrifying. Because you are the most important person in my life." I said, "And?" She said, "And if I say the thing properly and it goes wrong, I lose the most important person in my life." I stopped walking. She stopped with me. I said, "You said it at 2 in the morning in my bed. That already happened. The version of this that goes wrong does not begin with you saying it out loud. It begins with neither of us talking about it. With the polite texts and the growing distance that we both pretend is something else, until one day it is actually something else, and we cannot remember how we got there." She looked at me. The park was quiet. A few other people, distant, irrelevant. She said, "I've been thinking about it since before October." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I know you. I've been watching you think about it and not say it for long enough to recognize the shape of it." Her expression shifted. The careful surface she had been maintaining did something it had not done in 2 weeks. A small, honest fracture at the edges. She said, "I'm scared, Thea." I said, "I know you are." She said, "That's not enough for you, is it?" I said, "It's enough for tonight. But eventually I'm going to need more than just knowing you're scared." She nodded. One quiet nod. We had dinner and talked about real things. Her hotel commission, my current manuscript, everything that was not the thing. And I felt the polite distance of the preceding 2 weeks dissolve. At my building, she hugged me longer than the Sunday goodbye. She said, against my shoulder, "I'm working on the scared part." I said, "Take your time." She said, "Not too much time." She laughed, the real laugh, and pulled back and looked at me. She said, "Good night." I said, "Good night." I thought, going up in the elevator, that we might actually navigate this. The thought lasted 10 days before Priya texted on a Monday afternoon to say Simone had mentioned she was seeing someone. Casually, in passing. "But I thought you should know." I had not asked Simone to wait. I had not asked her for anything. I had told her I needed more, eventually. Not now. And eventually had arrived much sooner than I had prepared for. Her name was Dara. I found out the usual amount and made a policy of finding out no more. She worked in architecture. She was approximately Simone's age. She had no particular reason I should have any feelings about her at all. I had considerable feelings. I kept them where I kept all the things I was careful with. The first time Simone mentioned Dara directly, we were at the studio. She looked slightly flushed when she came out of a work call. She said, "Sorry." That was Dara. We had plans tonight and she needed to move them. I said, "That's fine, I was just dropping this off." She said, "Stay for a bit. Please." We made tea and sat at the long work table among her reference images and material samples, and I listened to her talk about the hotel commission with the vocabulary of someone who loved their work, and for the duration of the tea we were exactly ourselves. Then she said, without particular emphasis, "Does it bother you, Dara?" I said, "Why would it bother me?" She said, "I don't know. I thought it might." I said, "The honest thing is complicated." She said, "I know. Say it anyway." I said, "I'm glad you're living your life. I'm also having a harder time than I intended. Neither of those things is your responsibility." She held my gaze for a long time. She said, "I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing." I said, "About Dara?" She said, "About any of it. October." What I said. What I meant. What I've been doing since. I said, "And what have you been doing since?" She said, "Trying to convince myself it was the wine." I said, "Was it?" A long pause. The studio quiet around us. She said, "No." I said, "I know." She said, "Thea." I said, "I'm not going to make this easier for you. I have been making things easier for you for 7 years and I need you to stay in the hard version for a little while." Something moved across her face, the careful surface cracking further. She said, "That's fair." I said, "I know it is." At the door I stopped. I said, "When you know what you're doing, tell me. Not because I'm waiting, because you deserve to say it to someone who will hear it." I left. On the pavement outside, I let myself feel all of it for 4 minutes. Then I put it back where I kept it and went home. The following 3 weeks were the hardest I had navigated in years. Simone texted more than she had since October. Longer messages, late-night conversations spilling into the truest register of our friendship. She was maintaining proximity through language because the physical kind had become complicated. I understood it, and I responded to it, and I did not name what it was. It was Priya who finally applied the pressure. We met for coffee on a Saturday in December, and she said, "How long are you going to keep waiting?" I said, "I'm not waiting." She said, "You edit yourself around her now. You used to take up your full space. Now you're so careful not to take too much that you're not taking any." She said, "She is not fragile, she is scared." Those are different things. I said, "I know they're different." She said, "Then give her the full version." The gallery show. Second year. How long it has actually been. That is the thing you have been careful not to say, because that version is exposed, and you don't do exposed. But it is the only version that gives her something real to respond to. I said, "What if her response is the one I've been afraid of?" She said, "Then at least you'll know, and you can stop organizing your life around something you have refused to name for 7 years." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "While you're thinking, she's not getting any less scared." I said, "I know that too." I did not say anything to Simone that week or the next. I thought about what Priya had said, and I arranged it alongside everything else I was carrying, and I tried to find the version of honest that was not the version that burned everything down. The evening that forced it was not dramatic in the way I had imagined it might be. It was an ordinary Tuesday in mid-December. Simone called me at 7 in the evening sounding slightly hollowed out and said she and Dara had decided to stop seeing each other. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "It was mutual. It was the right call. I just keep—" She stopped. I said, "What?" She said, "I kept comparing. I kept being in the middle of something with her and comparing it to something I couldn't name, and it wasn't fair to her, and I knew it wasn't fair to her. And I did it anyway." I said, "What was the thing you couldn't name?" A pause. She said, "You know what it was." I said, "I need you to say it." She said, "Thea, I think I need to see you." I said, "Come over." She said, "Okay." She was at my door in 40 minutes, not drunk this time, entirely sober, in her coat and her scarf, and the earrings she wore when she was trying to feel solid, and when I let her in, she came inside and stood in my hallway without moving toward the kitchen or the couch. just stood there, close, looking at me. She said, "I have been an idiot." I said, "You've been scared." She said, "Same thing." I said, "Not the same thing. Idiocy is a choice. Scared is what happens when something matters." She looked at me. In the hallway light, close enough that I could see everything her face was doing, and it was doing several things at once. The composed surface she had been maintaining through October and November was not there. What was there instead was something I had seen glimpses of for 7 years and had never been given the whole of at once. She said, "How long, Thea?" The real answer. The hallway was very quiet. I said, "How long what?" She said, "For you. How long has it been for you?" The city was doing its evening things outside. The building hummed. Everything was very still. She said, "I need the full version, the one you haven't said yet." I looked at her. This was the moment Priya had been telling me to get to for years. The exposed version, the one that had no professional frame around it, no useful language to hide inside. Just the truth, specific and costly. I said, "Since the gallery show. In second year. When you walked in, and I stopped mid-sentence, and I have never finished that sentence to this day." She went perfectly still. I said, "That was 7 years ago. You walked in, and I stopped talking, and something rearranged itself, and it has not rearranged back since. I have been in love with you since that exact moment, and I have done nothing about it, because you are the most important person in my life, and the risk was never worth it to me." That is the full version. That is what I have been not saying. The hallway was absolutely quiet. She was looking at me with an expression I did not have a catalog entry for. Not any of the 7-year known versions. Something deeper than those. Something that lived underneath all of them and had been living there, apparently, for longer than I had known to look for it. She said, "7 years." I said, "Yes." Her voice, when she said the next thing, was very quiet. She said, "Thea, I have been in love with you for longer than I have been willing to know it." The hallway contracted. She said, "Every relationship I have been in since we met has ended at the same place, at the same question, at the same thing I couldn't name. And I kept telling myself it was fear of ruining the friendship. But I think what I was actually afraid of was what it would mean to say that the most important relationship in my life was already happening, and I had been refusing to see it." I looked at her. I could feel the 7 years between us. The weight of them and the specific cost of them, and the way they had somehow delivered us to this hallway at this moment. She stepped closer, not closing the distance entirely, just changing it, making it something different than it had been for the previous 7 years. She said, "Can I?" She stopped herself. She said, "What do you want?" I said nothing for a long moment. Outside the window, the city went on being the city, indifferent and ongoing, and she was standing in my hallway 3 years' worth of careful distance away and waiting for me to say it. And for the first time in 7 years, I could not find a single reason not to. She was standing in my hallway in December with 3 months of honest reckoning between us, and the space separating us measured in inches, and the city making its late-night sounds outside, like it was not aware that anything in particular was happening. She had said, "What do you want?" And I had said nothing for a long moment. I had looked at her. The earrings she wore when she was trying to feel solid. The scarf she had not yet unwound. The expression on her face that was not any of the 7-year known versions, but something that lived underneath all of them. And I had understood, in that moment, that I had been afraid for so long that the fear had become its own kind of furniture, present everywhere, moved around, navigated without thinking, as if it had always been there and always would be. It had not always been there. It had arrived in year 3 when I understood what I was feeling and decided that containing it was the only option. And I had contained it for 4 years after that, and the containing had cost me things I was still adding up. I said, "I want you to stay." She said, "I'm staying." I said, "I mean after tonight. I mean longer than tonight." I mean, I want you to understand that what I told you is not the kind of thing that has an expiration or a convenient version. It is the 7 years version, and it is specific and it is real, and I need you to know that before anything else happens. She looked at me. Her hands, which had been at her sides, came up to my face. Not quickly, slowly, the way she reached for things she intended to keep. Her palms warm against my jaw, her thumbs just below my cheekbones, her eyes looking at my face like she was cataloging something she had been not allowing herself to catalog for a very long time. She said, I know. I know what you told me. I have been thinking about nothing else since October, and the thing I keep arriving at is that I have been incredibly stupid for an incredibly long time, and I would like to stop being stupid now if you will let me. I said, you were scared. That's different from stupid. She said, I was scared and I made it your problem and I am sorry. I said, you're apologizing for being scared. She said, I'm apologizing for the Dara part. I looked at her. Something in my expression must have shifted because she said quietly, I did not start seeing her because I had feelings for her. I started seeing her because I was trying to prove to myself that what I said in October was the wine, and not the truth. And it was not the wine. It was not the wine at all. And by the third time I saw her, I knew it wasn't. And I kept going because I was a coward. I said, you stopped. She said I stopped, because being with someone else while you exist in the world felt like building something on bad ground, like something I would have to tear down eventually anyway, so why was I building it? I looked at the hands on my face. Warm, present. Specific in the way of hands that know where they are, and why. I said, you're here now. She said, I'm here now. I'm going to keep being here. If you want me to? I said, I've wanted you to for 7 years. She kissed me. It was nothing like the versions I had imagined across 7 years of carefully not imagining it. It was quieter than those, more certain. It did not have the frantic quality of things that have been held back too long and finally released. It had the quality of something that had known exactly where it was going the whole time and was arriving without apology. Warm and specific and entirely real, her hands still at my jaw, my hands finding the lapels of her coat because I needed to hold on to something, and that was what was nearest. We stayed there for a long moment in the hallway. When we separated, she rested her forehead against mine. I could feel her breathing. She said, 7 years. I said, 7 years. She said, I'm sorry it took this long. I said, you've said that. She said, I mean it more every time I say it. I said, I know. But it also took me 7 years to say any of it out loud, so I'm not in a position to collect on the debt. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she pulled back far enough to look at me, her hands still at my face, her expression doing several things at once. She said, what do we do now? I said, I was thinking you could take your coat off. She looked at me for a beat. Then she said, that is a very Thea answer. I said, it is a very Thea situation. She unwound her scarf. She took her coat off, and I hung it by the door where it had hung 100 times before. My apartment looked the same as it had an hour ago. The lamp in the corner, the book stacked on the low table, the kitchen island where she had sat that Sunday morning in October trying to find the language to walk back what she had said. It looked the same, and it was completely different. The furniture had not moved. The specific weight of every object in the room had rearranged itself. I made tea, which I did because I needed something to do with my hands, and because the situation seemed to call for the scaffolding of ordinary things. She sat at the kitchen island and watched me do it and did not offer to help, which she only refrained from doing when she was paying close attention to something. She said, when did you know? Specifically. I said, I told you. The gallery show. 2nd year. She said, tell me more than that. I said, you walked in 20 minutes late because you had been in the studio and you had paint on your forearm that you had missed when you wiped your hands. Blue, here. And you came and sat beside me and you said something about the piece on the far wall, and your voice had a specific quality to it. Not excited, just very certain, like you had seen exactly what the artist intended and were satisfied by that. And I looked at your profile and there was a sentence forming in my head, and I stopped saying the sentence I was saying out loud. She said, "What was the sentence in your head?" I said, "I'm not telling you that tonight." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because it's December and we've had a significant evening and I'm allowed to hold something back." She looked at me. Then she said, "Fair." I said, "You'll get it eventually." She said, "I'll get it eventually." We drank tea at the kitchen island at close to 11 at night in December, and we talked. Not about the 7 years, not about the accounting of it, but about the things we always talked about. Her hotel commission and the specific problem she was having with the color palette in the East Wing corridor, a manuscript I was editing that had a structure problem in the middle section I could not yet solve, a documentary we had both half-watched separately and had never watched together and kept meaning to. The ordinary conversation of two people who had been having ordinary conversations for 7 years, except that somewhere in the kitchen light, she had her knee against mine and neither of us moved away from it. At midnight, she said, "I should go." I said, "You don't have to." She looked at me, not the careful look, the direct one. She said, "If I stay, it should be because we both decided that's what we're doing. Not because it's late and it's cold and it's easy." I said, "I decided. Have you?" A pause. She said, "Yes." She stayed. In the morning, she was already awake when I opened my eyes. She was lying on her back looking at the ceiling with the focused expression she brought to problems she was working through. And when I turned toward her, she said, without looking away from the ceiling, "I've been thinking about what to tell Priya." I said, "What do you want to tell Priya?" She said, "The truth." I said, "The truth is going to make her extremely insufferable." She said, "The truth is going to make her say I told you so for approximately 6 months." I said, "Longer." She said, "Longer." She finally looked at me. Her hair was loose and her face was the morning version, no earrings, no coat, no professional frame around her, just her. "I'm okay with that." I said, "She deserves the 'I told you so.' She has been holding it for 5 years." She said, "More than that. Probably." I said, "Probably." She turned onto her side to face me and we were quiet for a moment. Outside the window the December morning was gray and slow, and the apartment was warm, and she was looking at me with the expression I had been cataloging since the gallery show in second year. The one I had not had the word for, that lived underneath all the 7-year known versions. I had the word for it now. I had had the word for it for 7 years. I had just been the only one holding it. She said, "Tell me something you've never told me." I said, "That's a very large ask for 8 in the morning." She said, "Tell me something small then." I said, "In 4th year, when you won the department prize for the landscape series, I went home and cried." She stared at me. I said, "Not because I was jealous, because I was so proud of you that I didn't have anywhere to put it. And the only way I could think of to deal with it was to go home and cry in my kitchen for about 15 minutes and then call you to congratulate you." She said, "I remember that call." I said, "I know you do." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You called me back 40 minutes after the announcement. I wondered where you'd been." I said, "Now you know." She said, "Thea." I said, "What?" She said, "I've wasted a lot of time." I said, "We've wasted a lot of time. It was both of us." She said, "I knew. I think I knew a lot earlier than October, and I kept turning it into something else. A really close friendship. The best friendship I've ever had. Something that could look like what it was without having to be what it was." I said, "I know." She said, "That was a very specific kind of cowardice." I said, "Or fear." We keep going back and forth between those two. She said, "Is there a difference?" I said, "Fear is the thing that happens to you. Cowardice is the choice you make with it. I think you had fear, and you made some choices about it that were not ideal. But I also think you stopped." She said, "I stopped." I said, "You're here." She said, "I'm here." I said, That's not a small thing. She reached out and her hand found mine between us on the covers, and she held on in the way of someone who had decided to hold on and was not looking for a reason to let go. I lay there in the December morning with her hand in mine and felt, for the first time in 7 years, like I was inhabiting the full version of the life I actually had. Not the managed version, not the useful version, the real one. We went to Priya's together 2 weeks later. Not because we had planned it as an announcement, but because Priya had texted us both separately to ask about the New Year's dinner she hosted annually at her flat, and Simone had looked at me across my kitchen island and said, "Should we just go together?" I said, "If you want." She said, "I want." We arrived at Priya's at 7. Priya opened the door, looked at us standing together on the landing, and said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "I need someone to explain to me why this took 7 years. I said, "We're working on that question ourselves." She said, "Come in. Both of you. I've been waiting for this longer than you know." She was, as predicted, extremely insufferable about it. She told us, over the course of the dinner, 3 separate stories that she had apparently been collecting for years as evidence, incidents from university that I had forgotten and Simone claimed not to remember, but clearly did. The gallery show in 2nd year. A party in 4th year where apparently I had looked at Simone across the room for long enough that 2 separate people had mentioned it to Priya afterward. I said, "You are enjoying this?" She said, "Immeasurably." Simone beside me was laughing. The unguarded laugh, not the furious one, her shoulder against mine at Priya's table and Priya holding court about years' worth of evidence, and the December outside the window and the dinner going on around us the way good things go on. Without announcement, without ceremony, just the specific warmth of being in a room with people you have chosen and who have chosen you. At some point in the evening, Priya looked at me across the table while Simone was in the kitchen helping with the dessert, and she said quietly, "How are you actually?" I said, "I'm good." "Actually?" She said, "Not functional?" I said, "No. Actually good." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad. It was time." I said, "I know." She said, "She's been afraid for a long time." I said, "I know that too." She said, "She's not anymore. I can see it from here." I looked toward the kitchen where I could hear Simone asking where Priya kept the serving plates. I could hear the specific quality of her voice. Easy, relaxed, present. The version of her that existed when she was not managing fear. I said, "Neither am I." Priya said, "Good. Don't waste any more of it." I said, "I don't intend to." The new year came. January was cold in the way that Januaries are cold when the holidays are over and the city remembers what it actually is, not the decorated version, the true one, stripped back and functional and occasionally beautiful in the way that stripped back things can be beautiful. We found our shape in January, not dramatically, not in a series of significant conversations or defined moments, but in the daily accumulation of being with someone without armor, the coffee made correctly without being asked, the knowing when to talk and when to let the room be quiet, the understanding of what each other needed before it was said. 7 years had given us the raw material. We were just building something honest with it now. She had a key to my apartment. She had always had a key to my apartment. I had given it to her in year 3 when she needed somewhere to leave her things while her studio was being renovated. She had never given it back and I had never asked for it. The key had not changed. The meaning of it had. One evening in late January, she let herself in while I was in the middle of a difficult chapter in the manuscript I was editing. A section where the structural problem I had been circling for weeks finally became visible, which meant I would have to take it apart and rebuild it, which is the best and worst moment in any editorial process. She came in, read my face immediately, set a bag of food on the counter, and said, "How bad?" I said, "I have to rebuild the whole middle." She said, "I'll make plates." She made plates and we ate, and she did not ask me to explain the manuscript problem, and I did not ask her about the commission she had told me was going sideways, and we sat together at the kitchen island in the January evening, being in the same room, which was a thing we had been good at for 7 years, and were now good at differently. After a while, she said, "The East Wing corridor problem." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I think the issue is that I've been trying to use color to do something that should be done with light. The palette isn't wrong. The approach is wrong." I said, "That's a good distinction." She said, "I only just thought of it now." I said, "Sitting here?" She said, "Sitting here." I looked at her. She said, "You've always been where I think better. I just didn't know what to do with that information." I said, "You knew what to do with it. You called me from parking lots in the rain." She said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "It's the same thing." She thought about that. Then she said, "Maybe." I said, "Definitely." She said, "You're insufferable." I said, "I learned from Priya." She laughed, and the January kitchen was warm, and the manuscript problem was still there, and the commission was still going sideways, and none of that was fixed or resolved or anything except exactly what it was. Two people at a kitchen island in January having arrived at themselves, finally, without armor. It was February, when the situation that had been waiting to arrive finally arrived. Not dramatically. Situations that have been waiting rarely arrive dramatically. They arrive in the specific small form of a thing said at the wrong moment in the wrong tone. But before February there was the rest of January, which I want to account for, because it deserves accounting. There was the evening in the second week when she came to pick me up from the publishing house, and I was ready on time. Actually ready, waiting in the lobby when she arrived. And she stopped in the doorway with the look of someone who is prepared for one thing and received another. She said, "You're on time." I said, "I can be on time." She said, "In 7 years, you have been on time for things involving me approximately twice." I said, "This counts as one of the twice." She looked at me with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say the thing or the kind version of the thing. She said, "You were waiting for me." I said, "The manuscript chapter resolved this afternoon. I was done." She said, "You were waiting for me." I said, "Possibly." She said nothing for a moment. Then she held the door open. Her expression was doing the thing it had been doing more frequently since December. The thing I had been not having a word for 7 years, and now had a word for, which was simply that she was looking at me the way you look at something you are very glad to have and are no longer pretending you don't want. We had dinner at the place we always went when neither of us had a strong opinion about where to eat. A corner restaurant 4 streets from the publishing house with good lighting and tables that were slightly too close together, which had never bothered us because we had always been the kind of friends who sat close. We sat close now in a way that was not different in degree, but different in kind. Her knee against mine under the table. My hand, at one point, at the small of her back when we came in from the cold, and I held the door. Small things. Very small things. The specific vocabulary of people who have decided to be a thing and are still learning the language of it. She said, "Over the pasta she always ordered at this particular restaurant," I told my mother. I looked up. She said, "Not everything. The version that covers the important part." I said, "Which is?" She said, "That there is someone. That it is serious. That I am—" She paused and looked at her pasta. "That I am happier than I have been in years." I said, "How did she take it?" She said, "She asked 3 questions. The first one was whether this person was good to me. The second was whether I was sure. The third was whether I had been waiting a long time to be this happy." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "Yes to all 3. I held that. She said, "She wants to meet you." She said it the way she says things she has already decided are going to happen. I said, "I've met your mother." She said, "Not like this." I said, "No, not like this." She said, She always liked you. That was never the issue. She said she was glad you were still in my life. I said, I was always in your life. She said, she meant glad in the new way. I said, the new way. She said, her exact words were, it's about time, which is what she says when she has known something was coming for longer than the people involved have admitted. I said, your mother and Priya would get on very well. She said, they've been comparing notes for years. I just found this out last week. I stared at her. She said, my mother has been asking about you specifically at every major holiday for 3 years. I thought it was just because she liked you. Apparently, it was because she liked you, and she was keeping track. I said, I am going to need a moment. She said, you and me both. Outside afterward, the January street was cold enough that our breath was visible in the lamplight. She put her arm through mine the way she had always done when it was cold, which was a gesture that had existed in the friendship for years, and now existed in the other thing too. And we walked the 4 blocks to the tube, without any particular hurry. Just the city going about its business around 2 people who were going about theirs. She said, at the entrance to the tube, I keep noticing small things. I said, what kind of small things? She said, the way you know when I need to not talk about the work. The way you always have the specific tea I prefer even though you drink coffee. The way you move a book to my side of the bed before I've asked. I said, that's not new. She said, I know it's not new. That's what I'm saying. None of it is new. All of it was already there. I'm noticing that it was already there, and I'm sorry I needed so long to let it mean what it means. I said, stop apologizing. She said, I'm not apologizing. I'm noticing. I said, what's the difference? She said, apologizing is about the past. Noticing is about now. I'm not in the past. I'm here. I looked at her in the lamplight at the tube entrance. I said, yes, you are. She said, that's all I'm trying to say. I said, I know. She kissed me at the tube entrance, which she did with the complete absence of self-consciousness of someone who has stopped thinking about what it looks like from the outside. Warm and brief and specific. The January cold around it and the city noise, and the specific fact of her. She went down. I walked home. I walked the 40 minutes instead of taking the tube because the night was cold and clear, and I wanted to be in it for a while, being in exactly the life I was in. It was a good 40 minutes. We were at a gallery opening, a group show that one of Simone's colleagues had work in, the kind of event where the wine is mediocre and the work is better than the wine, and everyone stands in small groups making assessments. There was a man there, early 40s, architect, someone Simone knew professionally. He was charming in the particular way of people who have practiced being charming, and he gravitated toward Simone with the directness of someone who had made an assessment and decided to act on it. I watched this from across the room with a glass of mediocre wine and told myself it was fine. It was fine. She was perfectly capable of navigating a charming architect, and I was not her keeper, and this was not a crisis. Then I heard him say something that made her laugh, and her hand went briefly to his arm the way it does when something catches you off guard, and I recognized the gesture. And I recognized it because I had been cataloging her gestures for 7 years, and something in my chest did something I was not expecting. I walked over. Not quickly. Calmly, with the wine, the way you move toward a group you intend to join. She looked up when I came alongside her. Her expression shifted in the small, specific way it shifted when she was reading me. She said, this is Thea, my... She paused for 1/2 second. My person. The architect looked between us and made the correct assessment in approximately 3 seconds, which I respected. He said, nice to meet you. He said it with the gracious resignation of someone who has read the room correctly and decided not to contest the findings. We talked for a few minutes. He excused himself. Simone and I stood together in the gallery with the work on the walls around us. She said quietly, my person. I said, is that what I am? She said, is there a version of that you object to? I said no. She said, I could say girlfriend. I said, you could. She said, is that what you'd prefer? I said, I'd prefer whatever version you are ready to say in public without qualifying it. She looked at me. Then she turned to face the gallery in the full, and I turned with her, and we stood side by side in front of a large piece, a landscape, oil on canvas, something involving light in the way that good landscape paintings involve light. And she said, without looking at me, "I'm ready to say it in public." I said, "Then say it." She said, "You're my girlfriend. That is what you are." I've been working up to that sentence for a while, and I'd like you to know that it is completely accurate and I'm not going to qualify it. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You don't have to thank me." I said, "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." Her hand found mine. She held on. In the gallery, with the work on the walls and the mediocre wine in my other hand, and the charming architect somewhere behind us getting on with his evening, she held my hand in the full view of everyone in the room. Neither of us flinched. Outside afterward, in the cold February night, she said, "I owe you something." I said, "You don't owe me anything." She said, "The thing I said in October. In your bed." My drunk best friend climbed into my bed and said, "I've wanted this for years." That was me. Drunk and honest for the first time and completely terrified. And you protected the friendship even then. You told me to go to sleep. You gave me the morning. I said, "I gave myself the morning too. I needed it." She said, "You could have said it. Right then. In the dark. You could have said it and you didn't." I said, "You weren't ready." She said, "I know. I'm saying, you knew that. And you knew it when you said say it anyway in October. And you knew it when you let 2 weeks of polite go before you confronted it. And you knew it when I told you about Dara, and you didn't ask me to stop. You kept knowing it over and over, and you never stopped giving me room to catch up." I said, "You would have done the same." She said, "I hope I would have. I'm not sure I could have held it together the way you did." I said, "I wasn't holding it together. I was managing. Those are different things." She looked at me in the February street, the cold making our breath visible, the city busy around us with its Friday night. She said, "I love you." I looked at her. The earrings she wore when she was trying to feel solid, which she apparently still wore on significant evenings, which was information. The scarf. The expression on her face that was doing several things, and none of them were the 7-year versions. All of them were something newer and better and specifically hers. I said, "I know." She said, "You've known for a while." I said, "You've been saying it in other languages for a while." She said, "Now I'm saying it in this one." I said, "I know." She said, "Thea." I said, "I love you. I have loved you since the gallery show in 2nd year." I stopped mid-sentence. I have never finished it. She said, "Finish it now." I said, "I looked at your profile and I thought, I am going to spend a very long time being in love with this person." She looked at me. She said, "You were right." I said, "I usually am." She laughed. The unguarded laugh, the real one, in the February street, her breath visible in the cold, her hand finding mine. I said, "That's the sentence. The one from 2nd year. That's what I stopped saying." She said, "I'm glad you finally finished it." I said, "Me too." We walked. No particular direction, just the city in February and 2 people who had arrived at themselves, finally and without apology, and a conversation that had been waiting since a Tuesday in 2nd year when she walked into a gallery 20 minutes late with paint on her forearm, and I stopped saying a sentence that took 7 years to complete. It was, as things that cost something tend to be, completely worth it. We were seen together at every event that followed. Priya's birthday in March, the department show in April where 2 of Simone's students had their first exhibited work, and she stood in the gallery looking at it with the expression she wore when she was more proud of something than she intended to show. The publishing house end-of-season party in May, where my colleagues met her as exactly what she was, and she shook hands and smiled and stood beside me, the way someone stands beside a person they have decided to stand beside publicly and permanently. Nobody asked. Nobody needed to. The information was visible in the way we stood and in the way we talked about each other in contexts where the other person was absent. Priya, who had been waiting for years and deserved the satisfaction, told anyone who asked that she had seen it coming since second year and was available to say, "I told you so to both of us at any time." We let her. In June, I finally told her the sentence, the full version, the one I had been building since October. We were in my apartment on a Sunday morning, and she was at the kitchen island with her coffee and the hotel commission drawings spread in front of her. The East Wing corridor problem finally resolved, and I came and sat beside her and said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up. She had the morning face. No earrings, no coat, no professional frame. Just her. I said, "In the gallery show in second year, when you walked in and I stopped mid-sentence, the sentence I stopped was this. I looked at you and I thought I am going to spend a very long time being in love with this person, and the frightening thing was that I didn't mind. That is the full sentence. I have been not finishing it for 7 years." She set down her coffee. She said, "That's the sentence." I said, "That's the sentence." She said, "You didn't mind." I said, "I didn't mind. I've never minded. Even the parts that hurt. Even the parking lots in the rain. Even Dara. Even the 2 weeks of polite texts. I didn't mind any of it because all of it was still you, and I would rather be in the complicated version of this than in an easier version of anything else." She looked at me for a long time. In the Sunday morning light, at the kitchen island with the East Wing corridor drawings between us, and the June coming through the window and 7 years of chosen proximity behind us, she said, "Come here." I moved toward her. She turned on the stool to face me, and her hands came to my face the way they had in December in the hallway, warm, specific, certain of where they were. She said, "I would say I'm sorry for how long it took, but I think you've just told me you don't need that." I said, "I don't need that." She said, "Then I'm just going to say I'm here." I said, "You've been here the whole time." She said, "I'm here differently now." I said, "Yes." She kissed me. Not the December kiss, though that one had been right too. This one was the Sunday morning version, the version that exists when there is nowhere to be and nothing to prove, and all the time in the world for something that has arrived and intends to stay. Patient, warm. The 7 years in it, and not as a weight, but as a foundation. When I pulled back, I rested my forehead against hers, and I could feel the warmth of her breath, and the city outside, and the June morning, and the particular solid fact of being here, in this apartment, with this person, in the full and honest version of the life I actually had. She said, "Tell me the next sentence." I said, "I don't have it yet." She said, "Take your time." I said, "I'll finish it eventually." She said, "I know you will." She pulled back and looked at me with the eyes that had always catalogued everything, and I looked back at her with the same, and we were both looking at a person we had known for 7 years and were only now fully seeing. Outside, the June morning was doing what June mornings do. Unhurried, ongoing, entirely indifferent to the specific significance of what was happening in one apartment in one city on one Sunday. It did not need to know. We knew. It was enough. It was, actually, exactly enough.